Hello, Travis. How are you?
I can't complain, my friend. Did you have a happy Thanksgiving?
Yes, very, very much. Thank you. And you?
Yes, I did. You know why we're laughing is because we're actually filming this before Thanksgiving, but
Well, I had a good Thanksgiving last year, so I'm not really lying.
no, we're not. So
Yeah, so that's right. But this is Travis and Ross, and this is Notes On, and we try to do Christ on purpose. And today we are going to talk about textual criticism. So, Travis, you got a lot to say, and I will ask you questions that hopefully will be thoughtful and trip you up and will be brilliant questions that you've never heard before. How's that?
you foisted this on me. I have nothing to say.
Okay, so why don't you tell everybody why you're interested, why we're talking about textual criticism now as opposed to any other time that we talk about stuff. And I'll just let you go, and as I have questions, I'll ask them.
Well, this show is quite random, and we just kind of say to ourselves, "What do you want to talk about now?"
Yeah.
And things that come to mind. So I'm actually looking back into this issue. Uh, my eyes are getting weaker, and instead of doing the wimpy thing like going to the eye doctor, I'm doing the manly thing by not going to the doctor at all. And that's what men do. But since my eyes are getting weaker, the text of my Bible, my New American Standard 1972 edition or 71 edition, which is quite old, uh, it's my eyes are weak, and so it's just harder to see the print. I bought an ESV a few years ago, and the print is so small it's just useless for me almost as a person who reading that translation. So I just got into looking into translations, which by getting a translation to use, what I mean by that is it's the Bible that I take out and about when I'm teaching, preaching, or whatever. If I go to a Bible study, it's the Bible I usually take with me. And this is, unless I'm in the mood to take one of my big study Bibles or something, but this is I like a thin little genuine leather Bible.
Mm-hmm.
No fuss, no muss, no big notes in there, just the page and maybe some references along the column. And that's it. I don't want anything fancy when I'm just out there either preaching or teaching or just studying. And because the print is so small for me, I decided to look into translations and what genuine leather Bible am I going to get next to use when I'm out and about. And that has gotten me into the rabbit hole of, well, should I revisit the issue of textual criticism and all that stuff? And so that's, I guess, why I'm getting into this.
So, why don't you tell us, first of all, what is textual criticism? Why is it important, and how long has it been a thing in Christian circles?
Very good. So textual criticism is the art and science of recovering the original text of the scriptures.
Okay.
Um, so it is no secret among scholars, and for some reason, it is a mystery among a lot of lay people that we don't have the original autographs of the text. We don't have the original autographs that were actually written. And by autograph, what I mean is, just to give an example, the actual parchment that Paul wrote on when he wrote the book of Romans.
Sure.
That would be the autograph. Anything that comes after that, say someone comes along and copies that onto another parchment, that's called a manuscript. And if since some people can be quite pedantic, Paul didn't actually write the book of Romans, he dictated it. Because we know in Romans 16, he had an amanuensis, if you will, a secretary. And that's indicated to us at the end of the book of Romans. But the point is that actual parchment with the text that Paul wrote, that is the autograph,
Right.
the self-written work. And we consider a work published when this is in the ancient world. A book is published when it is released into the public in such a way that the author no longer has control of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And so in those days, you would stand up and you would say, read publicly your work, and there would be people out there scribbling or whatever. That still means it's somewhat in your control. But when you write it in such a way that you encourage people to copy it, now it's no longer really in your control. And so everything else is going to be a copy. So the autograph, the published autograph is the releasing of your actual work in such a way that you have no control over it. And then people just start copying. Now, the question then becomes, how do we know that the copyist actually gave us what Paul originally wrote in Romans, or in any book for that matter?
Right. And let me bring up a distinction which I know is important, and maybe you can talk about this. The textual criticism for the Old Testament is different than for the New Testament.
That is
We have
true.
We have to think about it differently, and the what is evidence is different. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit, and then how we think about them differently.
Sure. So to give you the contrast, in New Testament criticism, the standard practice nowadays is to create what we call an original text. Sorry, I apologize. We can't create the original text. You can recreate the original text by collating all the best manuscripts together, studying them, and coming up with the best reading of that. And that product of that effort is called the critical text. And the general thought is that the older the manuscripts, the better. That's a kind of a rule of thumb that a lot of your textual critics go by.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no deference or bias you give in favor of any given manuscript or set of manuscripts. You just take the readings on a case-by-case basis. Okay. In Old Testament criticism, there is a standard text that is considered authoritative by the Jews and by extension classical Christians, and it's called the Leningrad text. It's a 10th century manuscript of the complete Old Testament, or as the Jews call it, the Tanakh.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have this Leningrad text that it was produced it's in the Masoretic tradition. The Masoretes were the ones who gave us the vowel points in the Hebrew, because Hebrew is it's a consonantal language, at least as it's written. So the vowel points are put in there to just kind of tell you how to read or pronounce these words. And the Leningrad text just is that. And so what you'll do in Old Testament criticism is you just accept that as your standard text. And then if there are any questions raised, you can go to other texts. So since we've been using that for millennia, for a millennium at least, we have discovered what is called the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are Hebrew manuscripts that were produced somewhere between 200 BC and about AD 100. It's a breadth. So some of our oldest manuscripts are really come from the Dead Sea Scrolls or Qumran. And so sometimes you'll find that a reading in Qumran is better than the Leningrad text. Sometimes you'll find that the Septuagint, which is a translation that began around 250 BC, can be better than the Hebrew text. And there's some places where we just have smudges in our various Hebrew manuscripts, bad readings that we're all recognizing. Say in 1 Samuel, Samuel is the least well-preserved of the Hebrew manuscripts. And it turns out that the Septuagint actually helps us recover the reading that was originally there. So that's kind of how Old Testament criticism is done. Modern New Testament criticism is not done that way. There's no single text that you kind of leap off from and sort of correct it if you find that there's a problem.
Are there any points of doctrine, Travis, that are at stake in the different readings in either the Old Testament or the New Testament?
I'm very happy to report, and this is not a controversial statement I'm about to give. The answer is no. There's no doctrine that is cardinal for the Christian. A cardinal doctrine meaning something that is essential for Christianity that is at stake with any of these variant readings. If I were to adopt literally any reading say, let's go back to New Testament textual criticism. If I were to adopt any reading that any scholar gives for a New Testament text, my understanding of Christianity would not change hardly in the slightest. It may affect the way I read a text, but it wouldn't affect what I believe as a Christian. My favorite example of this is Romans 5:1. There are two letters that stand for O in Greek. There's the omicron, and then there's the omega. And this change in one of those will change, say, the case of the term, and it affects the way you read the text. So some manuscripts will read in Romans 5:1, therefore, since we have peace with God, since we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God. So there's an indicative reading.
Mm-hmm.
Other manuscripts read, therefore, since we are justified by faith, let us have peace with God. So it's an exhortation for you to seek peace with God. Now, are there texts in the New Testament that exhort us to have peace with God?
Certainly.
Yes. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and cleanse us of all unrighteousness. Are there texts that tell us that we have peace with God? Well, Ephesians speaks of the peace of God that surpasses all understanding that we have access to as Christians. So either way, it's not like you lose any doctrine in that text. I personally think that the indicative reading is correct, but let's say that a textual critic came along and proved me wrong with just in impeccable logic, where I was having to say, uncle, I'm wrong, you're right. My beliefs as a Christian would not change. If you look at the New Testament and compare it to almost any piece of literature that's coming out of the ancient world, the New Testament stands far and above, better preserved than those texts. Second place in the ancient world is the Iliad by Homer. We have about 2,000 manuscripts of Homer. They're about 90% in agreement with each other, 95%. New Testament, 5,800 and counting. And there's only about a 1% difference when all is said and done between the manuscripts. That has to be qualified. When I say 1% difference, I mean there's only 1% of the issues in textual criticism where the reading or the variants are meaningful and viable. Okay. But those meaningful and viable cash out to the things that I just shared, like in Romans 5:1. That's a meaningful and viable variant to where scholars can legitimately disagree, and we don't know with certainty which is the correct reading. We just don't. I can't. I believe it's the indicative reading, but I can't claim. I'm not a textual critic, but I can't claim, especially since I'm not a textual critic, but I can't claim certainty about the reading. But either way, you're not really affecting doctrine. By meaningful and viable means it is a legitimate question as to what the reading is. Maybe this variant is true, or maybe that variant is true. And meaningful, it affects the meaning of the text. 98%, 99% of the readings are either viable but not meaningful, or meaningful but not viable, or neither. I mean, most of the differences, 98% or 97%, are things that don't even come up in translation. Like it'll say Christ Jesus or Jesus Christ.
Okay.
Or you might have a definite article in one and not the other. Or you might have a sentence starting out with the word gar, but others missing it. That's the Greek word for. Like, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, etc. So those would be just things that don't really matter one bit. And so even Bart Ehrman, who years ago made a stink about this, he wrote a book called Misquoting Jesus. And it was a popular version of his dissertation, The Orthodox Corruption of Scripture, where he was making the point that, we have these places in the New Testament where the scribes that were copying certain portions of the New Testament changed the wording because they were doctrinally motivated to do so. And the most famous example is in Mark 13:32. Jesus, I preached on this text just the other day, so I guess it's fresh on my mind. But Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour. I'm paraphrasing somewhat. Nor the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Now in Matthew 24:46, where we have the parallel, there are a significant number of manuscripts in Matthew, a significant number of older manuscripts, I should say, in Matthew, where that word "nor the Son" is missing. It says, so you don't read "nor the Son"; it just says "nor the angels," and no one knows, nor the angels in heaven, but the Father alone. Now, what's going on there? Well, Ehrman and others may argue that there were scribes that were embarrassed by that fact. So embarrassed were they that they smudged out, or they crossed out "nor the Son." Okay, now Dan Wallace, my Greek professor at Dallas Seminary, who recently retired and a famous textual critic, he has actually argued that the phrase "nor the Son," that scratching out originates with Matthew rather than a later scribe, because what Matthew may be doing is softening the statement of Jesus so it doesn't sound so harsh. Is that dishonesty on his part? Some would say yes. I would say no, because he does leave the phrase "but the Father alone" there. In fact, he's the one that says "alone," whereas Mark says "but the Father." And the word "monon" is not there in Mark, if I remember correctly. So that he's still saying that only the Father knows. Now, if Matthew did do that, if Dan Wallace is right, that would not be totally contrary to what we see Matthew doing in other contexts. So, for example, in Mark, Jesus goes into a town and it says he couldn't perform miracles there, whereas Matthew says he didn't perform miracles. And so Matthew is softening what was originally, maybe for listeners, an embarrassing statement or a harsh statement.
So you believe "nor the Son" is part of the original, or you're saying you think it was added?
No, Mark had the original quotation of Jesus, "nor the Son," and if Dan Wallace is right, Matthew took it out.
I see. Okay.
But Dan Wallace is, I don't know if I've not read all the textual critics on this, but I don't know of any other textual critic who would say that. There are many who would say no, a later scribe took it out. So it was originally in Matthew and Mark, but a later scribe took it out of Matthew. Dan Wallace's argument, though, is that it's hard to understand why a scribe would take it out of Matthew but leave it in Mark, because almost all our manuscripts of Mark have it in there. There's a late, I think, 10th century manuscript where we have a manuscript of Mark where he takes it out, but almost all the manuscripts of Mark have it in there. So he says the best explanation for how the variant arose is that Matthew had it out, but a scribe who's reflecting on Mark while he's copying Matthew corrects it and puts it in there. And so the idea is that in general, according to text critics like Dan Wallace, we go with the shorter reading. Usually the shorter reading best explains the arise of the longer reading.
It seems really
whatever
remarkable.
That's worth,
Okay. Seems really remarkable to me, Travis, that there's no doctrine at stake in the different translations. Is that remarkable enough that, in your opinion, is it evidence that this is divinely inspired and divinely preserved?
I wouldn't use the preservation in the New Testament or the Old for that matter, and I'm just as confident in the Old Testament's preservation as the New. I wouldn't use that as evidence of inspiration. I would simply use it as evidence of historical reliability. In fact, I think that Bart Ehrman's point. And when I was at this conference a few weeks ago, I got to sit and listen to Ben Shaw, who was presenting his book, Trustworthy. And Ben Shaw's new book, Trustworthy, is a new book out there. It's written for a popular audience, giving evidence for the trustworthiness of the New Testament. And I asked him about this, and he seems to disagree with me. But I tend to think that when Bart Ehrman wrote his book, Misquoting Jesus, he's really arguing against inspiration. He's not really arguing against the preservation of the New Testament. And the reason I believe he's arguing against the preservation, at least in general, of the New Testament, is because that in the new edition or the later edition of Misquoting Jesus, came out in paperback, he points out that if he and his old mentor, Bruce Metzger, who was the greatest textual critic of the latter part of the 20th century, and he was a mentor to Bart Ehrman. In fact, he and Bart Ehrman contributed to the fourth edition of Metzger's work on the text of the New Testament, which is the standard work used in most places to deal with these issues. If you're a student and you're just getting involved in New Testament textual criticism, that's probably the first book you're going to read. And Ehrman said if Professor Metzger and I got together to debate what we thought the original New Testament said, he goes, there's probably going to be maybe 7 places where we would disagree. And that indicates that he's not really talking about the preservation of the New Testament, but he's saying, why would God so inspire people that his word, or at least the autographs, are lost? Now, that's not an historical question. That's a theological and philosophical question.
Yeah.
Which we can bracket and put it aside maybe for the next show or something. The point is that what we have is what was written. In fact, I don't have it available right now, but if I were to show you, maybe next show we can do this, but if I were to show you a page of a critical edition of the New Testament, what you'd see is the text proper and the footnotes below. So the question is, if I hold up a critical text of the New Testament, am I in possession of the actual New Testament that was originally written? I'm 100% confident that I am. I know this. I claim absolute certainty that I'm in possession of the original New Testament that was actually written. What I'm not 100% confident in is that all the readings that were accepted in the text proper, that those readings are all correct. But the variant readings are all given in the footnotes, right? So it's either in the text proper or in the footnotes where we possess the original New Testament. We possess something like 102% of the text. So the issue is not what was lost, but the question is what was added to it. So the debate is, what do we remove, not what do we speculate on what to accept or something like that. So I'm very confident that we have the New Testament as it was written, but whether the New Testament is inspired by God, that's just a different issue. And what I would do is I would first build the case for the historical reliability of the New Testament before I even got into the issue of whether the New Testament is inspired. And I will say one more thing. Showing that the New Testament is preserved well proves that it's been preserved. It doesn't prove that it's reliable. Maybe what was preserved was just a bunch of nonsense.
Right.
And so the next stage in showing the historical reliability of the New Testament is to move beyond the preservation of the text, which I think we've secured, and get into the historical reliability of it. Did these authors say things that were true? And did they say enough true things to where we can say that the New Testament is basically historically reliable?
And so you're saying that's Bart Ehrman's argument, is that he's not saying it's not what we had 2,000 years ago. He's saying it's just made up, or
yeah, he's saying two things. It's definitely not inspired, and unfortunately, Dr. Ehrman would also say it's not reliable. Not that it's not been generally well preserved, but that there are just a lot of mistakes. There are contradictions between the Gospels. We can't really trust them there. Paul, of course, did not write all the books attributed to him. He only wrote 7, instead of the 13 that we generally accept as written by Paul. After all 13 of those epistles say, I, Paul, that goes on to, or Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, etc. I mean, that's how he introduces all of his letters. But he would say, no, a pseudepigraphical writer writing in Paul's name wrote, say, the book of Ephesians. But he's absolutely convinced that Paul wrote Galatians, for example, or Philippians, But Acts, a lot of mistakes there, a lot of historical nonsense there. Same thing with the Gospels. And so we can't really believe that the portrait of Jesus given in the Gospels is historically reliable. Maybe in the broad sense, there was a man named Jesus. He was crucified. His earliest followers did come to believe that he had risen from the dead, but he didn't rise from the dead. I mean, Ehrman's an atheist, so he's not going to say that he rose from the dead. So that's the kind of argument that Ehrman would get in.
How do we answer the arguments that say, which are pretty clear if you just get the Gospels out and look at them, the discrepancies or difference between, say, the empty tomb stories and those kind of things? How do we hold to inspiration and still acknowledge those differences?
Before you even get to inspiration, what I would say is, even if I had to cry uncle and say that there are legitimate contradictions, bona fide contradictions in these gospel stories, that wouldn't remove from them certain core historical facts.
Mm-hmm.
For example, the empty tomb. There are multiple reasons to think that the tomb was empty. Now, Ehrman's not going to agree with that. He's going to dispute the empty tomb. And so what I would have to do is give historical evidence for the empty tomb. But I wouldn't say you can reconcile all these things, therefore it's historically reliable. Just because even if I proved that there were no contradictions between the Gospels on the empty tomb story, that wouldn't mean that the tomb was empty. It would just mean that the 4 liars made up a story, or they all agreed on a story or whatever.
Right.
I would have to give historical evidence. On the same token, even if there are legitimate bona fide contradictions between these authors on the empty tomb, what happened, that doesn't mean that there wasn't an empty tomb. It just means that they all agreed on the core fact, but some of the details, there are contradictions between them. In the same way that if you and I saw a wreck, and you, me, and say 2 other people witnessed that, we may disagree on some of the details, and therefore there are contradictions. But that doesn't mean that there wasn't a wreck with this color car running into that color truck or something. And so if 4 people are describing an event and they are exactly the same in everything they say, especially when you're dealing with a crime, the police are going to look very suspicious of that because they're going to say there's collusion going on.
Yeah.
If there are differences and even contradictions, that actually enhances the legitimacy of the story because you have honest people trying to give you an event that happened. So the first thing I would say is you can't clear up the issue by either showing there are no contradictions or that there are contradictions. The question is, was there an empty tomb? And Geza Vermesh, for example, is a Jewish non-Christian scholar who would argue that even though there are all these contradictions, the tomb was empty. Pinchas Lapid doesn't even think that the New Testament can be trusted as an historical source, but he believes that the resurrection happened. He doesn't just believe that there was an empty tomb, he believes the resurrection. So there are people out there who've come to believe that Jesus rose from the dead, even while believing that the New Testament is historically unreliable.
Wow.
So the question is, are there certain facts about the historical Jesus that we can glean from the New Testament, even apart from its historical reliability, which provide adequate inductive grounds from which we can infer the resurrection? Or better put, is the resurrection the best explanation for the established facts surrounding Jesus' life and death? And
that's right.
Of course, I would submit that the answer is yes. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. So for me to open up that can of worms,
we'll do it maybe we can do it next week.
Yeah, let's do that.
All right. Thank you, Travis. It's always fun.
Always.